But this one, I remember the military order is the military order 854. And this military order was supposed to allow the Israeli government to become totally in control, to become totally in control of our university lives. Now, literally, now if you want to employ a professor, if you want to accept a student, if you want to develop or design a course, whether in music or in anything else, you had to get the permission of the military ruler. That didn't make any sense to us, and so we of course rebelled against it. Now think about this. This was a kind of incident. This was a particular instantiation of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And the instantiation was to do with the occupation. It was an occupation issue. It wasn't to do with the entire issue of the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. But very quickly, this very simple instance of conflict that drew me in and drew a lot of students and faculty members into the matter. This was, I'm talking now about the year 82, 83, those times. Actually, basically made me come at the end of the day to transform my ideas about our relationship with Israel and to start thinking that really we do need to have a solution, and that the only solution we can have is a two-state solution. That is the only solution that would make any sense. And I'm talking here about 1981, 1982. Now at the time, Mr. Peres, who became 90 years of age recently and celebrated his birthday, had other things on his mind for us. And in fact was conducting negotiations with the Jordanians. And was hoping that a deal would be reached for the West Bank Palestinians with Jordan. That's what he had. And actually the Labour Party, in general, in Israel, had this as an idea for very many years, that they would have a deal with Jordan. And they started talking about giving us autonomy, going back now to the question of autonomy, in association with Jordan. All right? So it was not autonomy, say, connected to Israel. It was autonomy connected to Jordan. And at the time, it didn't, hard as I tried, I couldn't really work out what that would mean. Except that, I would be living where I was living in Jerusalem or in in Ramallah, and I could vote, but I couldn't actually vote for any legislation that will affect where I'm living in Ramallah, because that will not be something that is under my sovereignty. I could vote, but I could vote for members of parliament that will be representing me in Jordan, whose sovereignty, whose legislative powers were only limited to Jordan. So it didn't make any sense. It basically told me, you will have a little bit more self-rule, but where it comes to real issues, and for instance, political rights, exercise them in Jordan. So I didn't like that, and in order to express myself that I didn't like it, I remember writing an article in a local, very, very limited, small piece of newspaper that we ran, and in it I said, why don't you go the other way? Why doesn't Israel just annex us? Why doesn't Israel just annex us? And I did this back in 83, 84. Now, the minute I did that, I wrote, why doesn't Israel annex us and just give us equal rights? And it makes better sense for me, I said. If I'm going to be voting for anyone living in Ramallah or Gaza, to be voting for somebody who's sitting in Jerusalem, in the Knesset, who can actually legislate for the place that I'm living in, which is Ramallah, but also in addition for other places that I consider to be part of Palestine. Akka, Rehovot, wherever you are, wherever you think, Tel Aviv. Why Amman? Why should I be able to legislate in Amman? This is what I want. Now, I wrote this article basically in order to provoke a reaction, which I did. So immediately, this reaction consisted of people, the Israeli side first picked this up, and in about maybe a few months, I became a TV star. My pictures everywhere. I was being interviewed, and one day I was taken in, interviewed by one of the major political shows on Israel TV, and they invited me and invited the person at the time who was the head of the settlement project in the West Bank, Gaza. And I came in, and I was at the time playing, I was playing a game to some extent because I wanted to provoke. And so, by the way, I am politically naive, but in that particular occasion, I exaggerated the naivety of my knowledge. So the guy would be asking me on this, it's a very popular show, would be asking me, and with the settler next to me, so you want to become an Israeli, you want us to annex you, you want to become an Israeli? And I'd say yes. And he'd say, but you know that, if you become an Israeli, you have to serve in the army? I'd say, yes, okay, if that's the rule, I'll serve in the army. He said, you mean you're prepared to serve in the Israeli army? And then I'd sort of look around and say, yes, if it allows me what is allowed to the next soldier in Israel, which is to be walking around in the streets with a a machine gun on my shoulder. Yeah, I'd love to be in the army. Then they'd ask me, and you're prepared to go into the Knesset and do the allegiance and so on. You have the State of Israel's flag and the national anthem. And I tell them, of course, yes, but surely, isn't it a democracy here? And they say, yes, of course, Israel is a democracy. And I say, okay, so but if I go in and others go in, and we're more of us than of you, can't we change the flag and the anthem? And the guy, this is being watched by everyone. So it was, I was basically saying that, look, if a two-state solution is not taken seriously now, and I'm talking back in 1984, if a two-state solution is not taken seriously now, very soon things will become very difficult, hard, and then impossible. So we have to do it immediately. And if you don't do it, things will unroll in this direction. We will end up in that kind of situation where Palestinians will start asking for political rights because there's no other choice. It's no other road open for them. Now, what I was saying reflected something a very important Israeli was doing and saying, by the name of Meron Ben-Vinisti. I don't know whether you've ever come across him. Now, Meron Ben-Vinisti used to work in the municipality of Jerusalem with Teddy College for some time. But then he came out and set up something called the something project. I can't remember now.
West Bank Project.
The West Bank Project, in which he tried to show through data collection that there is a pattern unfolding in the area. And the pattern is of creeping annexation, and he came up with the word, the expression, irreversible. And that was the first time the word, the expression, and the idea of irreversibility was used in the context of the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Now, what does irreversible mean? Irreversible, you think about anything, you put a thing on the table, it's reversible, I can take it back. But what he was saying was that underneath the bits and pieces that you are seeing on the surface of the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, underneath the surface of a building here, a settler there, something here, something there was an undercurrent, there was a pattern. It was like a historical pattern underneath the surface. And this is what is irreversible. It's going in one direction. And what you see on the surface, what you have on the surface, is simply the result, the symptom of what's underneath. And you can't really do anything about what's underneath. And Benveniste started talking about the upstairs, downstairs kind of situation. Upstairs, downstairs, you know, a situation where the Jews live on top, the Palestinians below, and there are two systems of infrastructure, one for this, one for that, but they're basically in the same area, but two-dimensionally. And I remember him saying once, you know, of course, if you're standing on Earth, you don't see it. But if you go up to the sky and you look down, you don't see two peoples in two countries for whom it is natural to live in two states. What you see is one country, one political organization, one entity, and the two peoples fighting inside it for political rights. So it's not a national confrontation. It's an internal civil fight between two ethnicities. That's how we put it. Now I'm talking about the 80s. And it is in the context of what he was saying, and what I at the time felt that I needed, you know, we needed to shake Israel out of its, you know, sense of confidence that things were going its way. But it wasn't to be done. It was, however, at that time and during that period, starting from the 80s, that we, the Palestinians, started to try and find, to build bridges with Israeli counterparts to see whether something can be done with the Israeli side on the question of two states. And I remember going to, for instance, one of the early talks, consultations that took place early 1981. And this was with some, at Harvard, it was under the auspices of, or organized by a professor called Herbert Kellman. Now, Herbert Kellman had also written an article, I think 81, titled Talking to Arafat, Talking to Arafat. And, you know, this was a major thing for him to have said that, because, you know, Arafat was not on the radar screen of any decent, self-respecting politician, whether in Washington or in the Arab world. So, you know, talking to Arafat was something very... Anyway, so Kellman was, saw, or thought he saw, that the only way to go forward in this conflict is to get the PLO to start discussions with the Israeli government. Although he knew that the Labour Party was going in the direction of Jordan, that the Likud party was going in the direction of itself, and was not interested in anything. So he started a series of talks, and I went to one of the earliest, maybe, and that was in 1981. And it was a major thing for me to go in 1981, or 1980, because it was the first time I joined a forum, formally, which had on the Israeli side the dreaded so-called Zionist Israelis. Because until then, the Palestinians were actually free to talk to, formally, to non-Zionists, to anti-Zionists, it was fine. But to actually sit at the same table with Zionists, that means to accept, legitimize the presence of a national Jewish entity or body or movement. So I went to that. So there were people on the Israeli side who were actually turned out on the very extreme left, people like Yossi Sarid, and people like, you know, people from Mapam. I can't remember their names now, they're out of the circulation. But, you know, at the time, even talking to these people was regarded by us as something very, very advanced. On the Palestinian side, Arafat sent a couple of people from the Palestine National Council, from abroad, from the United States, and he sent one of his office directors by the name of Hafif Safi, who later served in different postings, including the representative of the PLO in the Vatican. And me, I came from the occupied territories, and we started putting things together. And this was the first time that this process of trying to reach, from our side, to reach with the Israelis, you know, we were groping for ways to try and see if we can put together, design this two-state solution that people had begun to think about, talk about, write about. Now, there were many attempts. The one that really gave me a headache, in the sense that I got attacked physically for it, and was beaten up at my university was the initiative we started with people from the Likud party. And that was in 84, 85, I think. Now, this is where the Peres-Rabin thing enters. Because during that period, Israel had a two-headed government. And the security was with the Labour Party, and the premiership was with the Likud, right? Now, we didn't know this, but the Labour Party, that's to say Peres, Rabin, and people like that, were trying to actually come to an agreement with the Jordanians. This is to go on with the historic attempt at finding some kind of territorial solution in Jordan. So this was what they were doing. Right at about that time, we were approached by people representing people close to the heart of the Likud party, and the so-called, what they were called at the time, the Likud princes, who are now out of circulation mostly, but people like Olmert and Meridor and others. And we were told, and by we, I'm talking here about